but we'll see.
Yes.
There you go.
There were a fair number of people that could not make it on the 8th and kept saying, are you going to record? Are you going to record? So we're recording.
Yeah, and I will also, I'll send that out probably tomorrow or the next day. And I'll also include the things that are, the materials that are being posted in the chat as we go along, so that you can have those to review at your leisure rather than while you're listening to this interesting conversation. Okay,
So
we passed the 75 mark. Are we ready to get
Okay.
going?
Yeah, let me just check. If people could please kind of identify themselves with their names in their boxes, that's helpful. I'm wondering, I see Ed, but with no picture, and just wondering, hey, Ed, welcome. Are you?
Louise, maybe people don't know how to change their names. I don't know.
Oh, sure. If you click on your picture or click on the 3 dots, I'm sorry, it will allow you to click down and say rename.
Shall I start?
No, just a second. Oh, well, I do see Beth has asked whether we're recording Thursday night as well. We are recording Thursday night. So are we ready to begin now, Louise? We want to start? We've got everything under
Yeah,
control?
why don't we go ahead and get started? So.
Okay, great.
All
Welcome, everybody. And this is the welcome to the Kent Street Coalition. For those of you who have not, this is your first time with us. Welcome. We have a number of reps and dignitaries on the Zoom today, and thank you all for your service and thank you for participating. This is the 6th or 8th meeting we've had, I think, so far this year, and I'm pleased to say this is the 3rd one we've done on education. We have identified the confluence of education and property taxes as something that we think can gain us some ground to come the election in 2022. And so we are continuing that process of focus on education. Last thing I'd say, on Thursday night, we have a terrific panel. We're going to answer all your questions about HR1 and S1 and the strategies all involved. We've got Chris Pappas is coming to talk us. This is For the People Act, the voting rights bill that's so important to democracy in America going forward. Melanie LeVake and David Cote and Kelsey Komentowicz and Lucas Meyer and my wife are all going to be on that panel. It's going to be a terrific panel. You have gotten, I'm quite sure that I've gotten, all of you have seen probably 20 times emails from me asking if you want to sign up. So please do, and hopefully we'll see as many of you as we can on Thursday. And now let me turn the evening over to Sue Ford. Welcome, Sue, and you're in charge. Good.
Thank you, Rob. And I'd just like to say welcome to everyone. Education is one of my passions. I am delighted to be able to share what's going on with the group that's here. We have a significant number of people who have really made this Zoom happen. Mary Heath is here, Representative Heath is here. Mary Wilkie is here, and she's been doing some resources for us. Dave Dougherty is going to keep track of questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat room, and then he will try to make sure that we get those answered at the end. And Rob is here doing all our technology. And Louise is always a wonderful person to have on any Zoom. Jennifer and Berkshire and Jack Schneider are joining us. And again, put your questions in the chat room. And I'll give you a little bit of my personal opinion. I'm sure it's a surprise to many of you here, but the New Hampshire budget is awful. It is terrible. It has an abortion clause. It has a divisive concepts bill, whatever that means. It has this voucher bill 130. I think the bills that say don't let the kids vote are standalone bills, but we're looking at the voucher bill tonight, and then we'll talk a little bit about the tax cuts that are going to be, that are in the budget, that are going to be a huge issue, not this year, but in the next budget cycle. It's going to be a disaster. So I hate to say it that way, but this budget is a disaster, and we needed to get that information out, and we need to talk about it, and you're willing to please put any kind of questions you have in the chat room. Our guests tonight are Jack Schneider and Jennifer Berkshire. Jack is an assistant professor of education at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. And the best description I read about what he does is his work explores the influence of history, culture, and rhetoric in educational policy. I don't know about you, but I haven't read anything about the history of education since I left college. And that was a very, very long time ago. So we appreciate Jack bringing us back up to 2021. Jennifer Berkshire is a expert in podcasts. She has written about education in numerous journals that you know about. She created a podcast about the educational policy that she co-hosts with Jack Schneider called Have You Heard? And I'm going to listen to that soon. She teaches aspiring podcasters in the journalism program at Boston College. She's written about the labor battles in the Midwest. And someday I'm going to have a conversation with Jennifer because I was an administrator in Elgin, Illinois, when all of these strikes were going on. And as a principal, it was a very difficult time. I'm hoping that the wolf in the schoolhouse door becomes required reading in every university program across the country. I listened to their presentation a couple of months ago, and I was struck by what I didn't know, nor I had no clue about. But I had my iPad sitting next to my PC when I was Zooming, and I had the book ordered before their presentation was over. It is a phenomenal book. A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. The title is terrific. The inside reading is even better. So Jack, we have quite a few knowledgeable educators on this Zoom. Can you give us a quick Twitter vision on how we missed this movement toward privatization of our schools and school districts?
Sure, and I'll apologize in advance for the sounds of amateur Vivaldi coming from downstairs as my 11-year-old gets her obligatory practice in.
Absolutely.
They don't teach music much in the schools anymore, but we have to make sure that we're ready for Wednesday's music lesson. So I think that a lot of us missed this because whether we lived through it personally or we are intimately familiar with the history, many of us thought that we dealt with this in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, one of the first things that he did in the White House, and certainly the first move he made with regard to education, was try to push through a pretty small scale voucher. This was with the support of William Bennett, who has remained a player in this world, a co-founder of K-12 Inc., which has made billions off of the effort to find a way to leach funds out of public schools and into private pockets. And Reagan tucked tail and didn't really want to have anything to do with education for several years as a result of the massive rejection of voucher proposals by mainstream Republicans and Democrats, not just in Washington, but all across the United States. People had no interest in it. It was obvious to them what was wrong with it, including one of the most often cited issues was that it would just be a tax break, right? It would be a refund for people who had never sent their kids to public schools, who would just essentially, this was, I think, a $500 voucher that Reagan had proposed. It'd just be $500 in the pockets of the 10% of people who had already opted out of the public education system. They would just get that back. And where's that money going to come from, right? It's going to come from public education. People didn't like that, since 90% of us send our kids to public schools. You know, we can talk about this later if you all want to, but this has come back from the dead for a variety of reasons. But one of them is that it's not packaged in a straightforward way anymore, right? In many of these cases, it's not being presented as a universal voucher. It's not being presented as a plan to move people out of the public education system and into private schools. You know, you can give Reagan credit for at least being straightforward. But being straightforward led to people understanding what the plan was, and they weren't on board. I think a second reason, and Jennifer's going to start rolling her eyes pretty soon, because you asked for like a Twitter post length response, and I've got 3 reasons already in my head, and I'm probably going to come up with a 4th or 5th. I'll stop after 3. A second is that for the past quarter century, until a couple of years ago, there had been an abiding neoliberal consensus that had dominated education policy, particularly in Washington. And so this is mainstream conservatives and mainstream Democrats agreeing to a sort of common approach, which is not to say a good approach, but a common approach in which the only kind of exposure to markets would be through charter schools. That was what they had agreed to. There were other elements of this unspoken treaty, this unwritten treaty, but with regard to privatization, Republicans stopped pushing for vouchers and Democrats stopped opposing it. And in return, they kind of met in the middle and said, well, we'll do this thing called chartering, which had emerged in Minnesota in the early 1990s and had spread pretty quickly to a few other states, including California. And the idea was, well, these will be public schools. They will be open to anybody who wants to attend. They will be taxpayer funded. They will be overseen by some public entity, and people will be able to choose into them. There will be market-like elements to them. So they were a compromise. And many of us thought that that was it, that was the final compromise. Democrats, for instance, like Cory Booker, thought that that was the end game. And then Betsy DeVos emerged on the national stage and reminded us, oh no, right? This was a waypoint. This was a midway point on the path towards a much more radical vision in which there are no public schools. And DeVos was pretty clear from the beginning in terms of messaging that. And one of the things she was really effective at was normalizing some really radical rhetoric about education. Like there's no such thing as public education as long as the public dollars are going towards students, that's public education. Well, that's not how I define public education. And then a third reason would be that I think many of us, myself included, thought that privatization was really about the effort to make a profit, right? I think for a long time in the early aughts, that's how I was seeing privatization. And I think that was informed by the efforts of the 90s, by people like Chris Whittle, the founder of Edison schools. And Edison was just trying to do public schools, but in a way that would, produce, they would find some excess there, some fat that they would trim from the bone and return to shareholders. And it didn't work, right? It was hard to make a profit in public education because there is no fat. There's nothing to cut there, unless you're going to admit that you are willing to cut what's right for kids. And so I think many of us brought that frame of mind to this issue where we were thinking, oh, privatization is about profiteering. And in some ways it is, but in many ways it's just a deeply ideological move informed by an antipathy to labor unions, to government, to anything resembling collectivism, to the public good. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the first few chapters of our book. All right, that was too long. I'll be shorter on my next one.
Thank you. Jennifer, I was appalled when our Arizona and the West Virginia teachers went on strike, and they started putting their salaries into the mix, they weren't making anything, and some of those people had not gotten a raise for 10 years. Is this going on across the country? It doesn't happen in New England. We know we don't pay as much in New Hampshire as they do in Connecticut, but on the other hand, I lived in Connecticut and it's cheaper to live in New Hampshire. How did that come out, Jennifer?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for having us. I'm actually doing this. I'm reporting to you from the Midwest tonight. I'm in Illinois visiting my dad, and you may hear him in the background. He and I have differences of opinion on what quiet means and what other room means. But I'm sure the dinner he's making will be good. So that's an important and relevant question that you just asked, because the reason that those teacher salaries were so low is because those states were committed to having the lowest possible tax burden, especially on their wealthiest citizens. And their theory was that if you could offer low taxes, that was how you were going to recruit businesses. And we're starting to see research come out from very mainstream economists in those states, in places like West Virginia, Indiana, and Arizona, that demonstrates that that has turned out to be totally untrue. That what happens when you stop investing in public education, in things like teacher salary, in things like school spending, the education attainment of your citizenry drops. You have to spend more money to lure businesses to your state because you can no longer hold up the promise of a well-educated workforce. You have to spend more to recruit students from out of state to attend your universities, because the students who are coming through your schools, or in the vision that's really being laid out in New Hampshire, students who are attending private school, being homeschooled, attending for-profit micro schools, or whatever the thing is coming down the pike, there's no longer really any guarantee that those students are going to be able to perform at the level of your flagship universities. One other thing about this that I think is really interesting, an underreported story during this legislative session around the country, is how much of the legislative agenda was really payback directed at those teachers who walked out in 2018. And so in places like West Virginia and in Arizona and Indiana and Florida, you really saw a lot of emphasis on getting back at the teachers and making sure that it was harder for them to exercise collective action in the future. Right. So right to work, it keeps coming back, and I'm not actually sure what the status of right to work is in New Hampshire right now, but even though your teachers may not be shutting down all the schools or walking out the way we've seen in other states, does not mean that they don't have the potential to organize collectively. And that's what really makes them such a target.
Thank you. I can assure you that right to work for less in New Hampshire went down for the 38th time in the House last week. Thank you, House representatives, both Democrats and Republicans. In New Hampshire, we don't allow for profit charter schools. I thought that was one of the best things they decided not to do, so that we do not have the profit charter schools, but we do have the nonprofit that do not have to follow the rules and regulations of the New Hampshire Department of Education. We also have a commissioner that is really interested in having more and more charter schools in New Hampshire, so that's part of the issue. Jack, is that playing out across the country? They're still adding lots of charter schools?
Yeah, and I think that if we see charters in the framing that I presented a few minutes ago as both a kind of consensus compromise between mainstream Democrats and mainstream Republicans, and also a means to a long-term end for the more ideologically committed members of the sort of harder right, I think that helps us understand what's going on here. So, in many places, these efforts to create more autonomies for charter schools were, in some cases problematic, but at least good faith efforts by mainstream Republicans and Democrats to try to create spaces for maybe some innovation. Some of that was informed by neoliberal thinking, which I think is often problematic in terms of its application to education. I don't think schools improve when they compete against each other. They're a different kind of industry. And that was in many ways, some of the thinking here is that we wouldn't need to regulate them as much because they would essentially be regulated by their customers. And we know that families are much different than customers in terms of their engagement with schools, right? We don't need to think long about the analogy here to realize, right, we're not shopping for schools the same way we shop for, let's say, a pair of blue jeans. You can't change as frequently. In fact, you don't ever want to change, right? You want to find the right fit for yourself and for your kid. And in fact, you probably don't want that much variety in the market because we all generally believe in equity, that everybody should have access to the same sort of package that gives kids all of the kinds of opportunities that they deserve. So I won't go into detail there, except to say that I think we can assume that it was a good faith effort by neoliberal Democrats and sympathetic mainstream conservatives. And much of it was built around belief in market logic, as well as, I think, some good faith efforts to create opportunities for educators to not be constrained by the same kinds of rules and regulations that we know are often constraining in traditional public schools. They exist for a reason, but they can be very constraining. At the same time, though, I think we need to recognize that it's not always a good faith effort, right? And that in many cases, people who are opposed to the idea of public education have used this sort of autonomy pathway for charter schools as a way of freeing them up to do things that maybe we don't want any school to be able to do, but that might be damaging for public schools, right? Or perhaps to place increased burdens on public schools in a way that might be harmful for them, might make them less attractive to families. One example of this can be found in Arizona, where Jennifer and I spent a long time trying to figure out why would Arizona build in no ability for the state to track the money that had gone to parents preloaded on what they call the education debit card, right? If you're a good faith conservative who believes in markets, you probably don't want those dollars being spent at the Apple store or on Amazon for, a new iPhone or, I don't know, a bike for your kid, right? Something educational about each of those products, but probably not the equivalent of a K-12 education that is being funded by taxpayers. We were trying to understand, why would you build in no ability to track where those dollars had gone? And then we realized that it's because they actually don't care where those dollars go. They actually want to make it easier for people to use those dollars outside of the public system. And if they still decide to send their kids to the public schools, all the better, right? Because then you're maintaining the same kind of burden on the schools to serve basically the same number of kids, but you're extracting funds and limiting the effectiveness of those schools by draining off resources in a way that is therefore untraceable because you have limited the ability of government to follow those dollars. And so this is an example, this is not every case, of the kind of bad faith efforts to use rules and regulations, or the absence of rules and regulations, to advance the private sector at the expense of the public sector. And I'll just note that while you said that for-profit charters are not allowed in New Hampshire, that is the case in many states, but it's also the case that nonprofit charters can establish contracts with, let's say, their landlord to pay exorbitant rent on the space that they are leasing. And the landlord just happens to be the charter school founder, right? This is the McDonald's model, where Ray Kroc figured out that the way you make the money is by owning the land and leasing it to whoever your franchisee is. There are lots of ways to make money from a nonprofit charter school.
And they are doing that in New Hampshire. And Representative Heath will be talking a little more about HB 130, and I think it may now have been exported from Arizona to New Hampshire because there's no accountability at all. As I've listened to people talk about education and talk about that, the Republicans tend to talk about that the educational money that is allocated by the state, it belongs to the student and the parents. And so they can take that where they wish. Democrats tend to talk about the state money belonging to the towns that support their local schools. You start to hear that in conversations when people come up and talk to you at the finance committee about what they're planning. Is that generally accepted?
I think that's actually a really good way to put it. I think about it as the difference between, they want us to shift from a model that's centered on we to a model that's centered on me. And the reason is that as long as you have the we acting, they have the power to do things like band together and demand higher taxes in order to support more school spending, in order to support schools, a way of funding schools in New Hampshire that might actually be fair, to pay for things like better updated school facilities. And so I think the big shift has been that ideas that would have struck us as patently absurd, even, as recently as a decade ago, like the idea, one of the common refrains that you hear again and again right now is that, don't invest in systems, invest in individual children. If you translate that into another field, say transportation, right? Like we would laugh if we heard somebody saying, don't invest in transportation systems, invest in individual commuters, right? It makes no sense at all. Right? Like, are they going to build the airport because Sue has decided that she wants to be a snowbird and head to Florida for the winter? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. And I think that it really, the evolution of this debate really tells you a lot about the state of the Republican Party in New Hampshire. In the past, the real break on things like an unregulated school voucher program came from your kind of Republican Party stalwarts who didn't like it because they were cheap, right? Like, who they are. In our podcast that we recently did about New Hampshire and the influence of the Free State Project, we interviewed veteran columnist Susan Bruce. And she said that this was really the big change that she had noticed, that these legislators who had been around for a million years, and they would put the brakes on things at the last minute and say, we can't afford to do that. And, everyone gets so irritated, but now it turns out that they were really the guardrails against a much more ideological vision. And to me, it's so telling that we can't even get the advocates of the voucher program in New Hampshire to say how much it's going to cost, right? Like, think about how recently in New Hampshire's history that would have been outrageous.
Absolutely. The one thing besides me getting a chance to clean out my closets, the one thing that happened in the pandemic is that parents learned how difficult it is to be a teacher. People had no idea how hard it was to teach a second grader or a first grader, and I'm still not sure how to teach a first grader how to read over Zoom. But the past year has been really chaotic. School systems were praised for their response, keeping kids out. Then they were vilified for not sending them back to school. How's the pandemic affected public schools? Do you see it as a positive or a negative?
I think it's both. So, on the one hand, as you said, I think a lot of people began to appreciate not just the difficulty of teaching, which they realized is about a whole lot more than content knowledge, right? That was a big win, I think, for the profession, where people realized, oh, you can't simply know math to be a successful math teacher. In fact, that is probably the easiest part of being a successful math teacher. But I think they also realized, gosh, schools do all these other things that hadn't really been on my radar. For me, of course, most of them were because I study this stuff for a living. But I did begin to realize, how deeply my daughter depends on her school to bring her into contact with other kids. That is a core part of what her school does, and it's a big reason why integrated schools are so important. Because it's not just about interacting with your friends, it's about interacting with all kinds of people so that when you graduate and enter the real world, you're able to carry on a conversation, perhaps even a productive one, with somebody who sees the world completely differently than you do. I think a lot of parents realized that schools were the place where their kids got exposure to art and to music, right? So we happen to be a middle-class family that can afford to pay somebody to teach our daughter violin on Zoom. We're not doing that anymore because school is back. But we were able to do that during the pandemic, and lots of other families weren't. School is the place where kids get exposure to so many things that otherwise they might not ever figure out. Actually really turns them on, right? It's something they're talented at. It's something that they really appreciate, that they want to do for the rest of their lives. And I think for many people, school has always obviously been a place where they get some of their basic needs met. And I think that some of us who don't have our basic needs met realized that. The school across the street where my daughter goes, they spent, I would say, 5 hours a day in the morning and at lunchtime handing out bags of food to families whose kids get breakfast and lunch from the school every day and who would walk by so that they could continue to be able to feed their children something nutritious at least 10 times a day. And so for those of us who are connected to schools who maybe didn't realize how much of our social safety net in this country is dependent on public education, probably to the detriment of our schools and our kids, but nevertheless, at least it's there instead of nothing. I think people realize that. So that's the plus side. The negative side is that there are lots of opportunities for opponents of public education to use the pandemic in some way to their advantage. Vilifying teachers is one. So while we are gaining this new appreciation for teachers and probably saying lots of positive things about our own kids' teachers, I think many of us have heard messages about how teachers were the ones who kept the schools closed, right? That's a very intentional messaging that is designed to take power out of the public education system, right? And distribute it in a way that would empower consumers, but would probably be bad for kids, right? So where are the places that weren't closed? For-profit schools, private schools, micro schools, schools that aren't schools, right? All these sorts of alternatives that in most cases are no better than, and in some cases are much worse than public schools, right? That suddenly there's a selling point, right? The customer is always right in all of these other places because in public education, the individual family is not the customer. There is no customer. It's a public good. It's a democratic community to which we all belong. And so many people have used the pandemic to try to leverage people's anxieties about not being able to control their own destinies and not being able to act as free agents in a free market like they do on Amazon every night. And maybe that's a good thing that they can't do that all the time in all forms of public life. And then they have also used the pandemic, despite the very negative experience that so many people had with online schools, they've used the pandemic to try to normalize this idea of schooling online, right? Sure, it didn't go well in lots of cases, but that's because teachers weren't ready to do it. That's because they didn't have the right software, but you've seen how convenient it is. You've seen that at least it is possible and we can do it better. And this, of course, has been a longstanding dream among those who A, want to cut costs, who B, are opposed to teacher power, and who C, are in favor of marketization, right? All of these are easier in an online situation, right? Well, I'll take those in reverse order. It's easier to create a competitive market in online education because, right, parents suddenly can choose from, hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of schools because they're all accessible online, as opposed to how many schools can I legitimately get my kid to from my house in the real world. The aim of breaking teacher power is easier because teachers may never meet each other, right, if they're teaching from their living rooms via Zoom. And then the first one, that, online schools will make it easier for, oh, I lost my train of thought there. What was A? I had a Rick Perry moment.
Here,
Who knows what A
I'll
was?
help you out, Jack.
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
wanted
thanks,
to add to
Jennifer.
that as we were working on the book, we obviously had no idea there was going to be a pandemic. But you could see even, like within weeks after schools started shutting down, that there were clearly organizations and individuals who saw this as a big opportunity and that they had policy ideas ready to go, often policy ideas that were actually very old, right? That they now have names we're not used to, like education savings accounts. Even that is Reagan era innovation. But we've heard again and again that the reason that state legislatures need to enact these sweeping policy programs is that parents are demanding them, that what happened during the pandemic opened up parents' eyes to the weaknesses of public education. And so that's why we need to fund things like private school and homeschool. We need to offer more online options. And I often point to New Hampshire, where we got to see quite vividly that the public felt very strongly the other way, right? That this turns out to be exaggerated in almost all states, and that what you really saw is that the pandemic kept teachers and other advocates from being able to organize in an effective way, or they were simply shut out. Right, that your legislators made the mistake of letting us see and count how many people were opposed to this program, so they had to sneak it into the budget. But just recognize that when you ask about the impact of the pandemic on education, it's also a political story.
Yes, it is. And I'd just like to put a shout out to some of the support groups that were helping us. There's no question, but the school bus drivers up in this area started delivering meals to kids at lunchtime, and they would drop it off, and they were monitoring kids to make sure that they were healthy and well put together, and going back and telling the person that runs the bus driver that that was fine. So it was incredibly helpful to have that kind of local town support. And we saw that a lot up here in the North Country. Mary Heath, Representative Heath, it's time to bring you back into the conversation, because there's no question that Representative Heath has been on the Finance Committee now for 2 years. She has been working and has background in education for her entire career. In fact, worked at the commission, the Department of Education in New Hampshire. Mary, you want to talk a little bit about HB 130 and how it's a voucher bill on steroids?
Well, I want to talk about how it's in our budget now.
Yes.
As passed in the New Hampshire Senate. So we have what we call education freedom accounts. And those freedom accounts permit parents to disenroll their children from school districts and receive the adequate education aid funding that the school district would have received. Dollars can be used to support education-related experiences, including tuition and fees at private schools. I just want to add one thing. There's an eligibility requirement of 300% of the federal poverty guidelines that the children have to meet in order to be eligible the first time. But after that, that doesn't hold anymore. So that kind of opens the door to a lot of different things, especially right now during COVID, because so many people were out of work. So they would meet that 300%. So again, these dollars can be used basically for almost anything: hardware, education, tutoring, textbooks, uniforms. We don't know how it's going to be, how people will be held accountable for those dollars. To be eligible, students must be a resident eligible for public education and from a household with an income below 300%. It's so difficult. The Department of Ed said that to project the actual cost of this Freedom account is very difficult. And so the Senate only put in $3.45 million during the biennium, each year of the biennium. Now, my calculations, we have about 22,000 children, probably 6,000 homeschoolers, 16,000 children going to private schools. Now, if only half of these, well, if all of them decided to take advantage of this, it would probably run the state about $81 million. More than likely, it wouldn't be that high, but I would say easily that in fact, if this voucher program, these Freedom accounts become a reality, we're looking at at least $50 million that will come out of our education trust in our budget.
And good for property taxes.
And well, it's what there is a clause in the Senate's bill, the budget, that says that school districts will receive 50% of the grant the year after the student departs. So if it's $3,700, like in Manchester, the average adequate education funding is around $5,000. So we'd receive half of that for the first year, and then 25% the next year. And then after that, there would be no aid provided at all. And remember, in our public schools, we don't just have one child in a classroom, and those fees cover a lot of different things. So that basically is what's happening in the budget in terms of the Freedom accounts. We're very concerned about this. I just want to add that when Sue and I actually, in my last term on the Finance Committee, after 2 terms on House Ed and 42 years as an educator, we came up with a budget that boosted educational funding for our public schools. We sent money, we targeted funding for free and reduced lunch. We provided disparity aid for those school districts that could least afford it. That $47.5 million disappears in the Senate budget. I mean, we do have some things in the budget. The Senate budget did add $17.5 million for free and reduced lunch. And they also, one of the things that I think is a good thing, they the enrollment projections within the Senate budget, they gave school districts could use their pre-pandemic enrollment numbers, which is a good thing. And we also are seeing more money going into school building aid, which is a plus. So we're seeing above the House budget about 30 million going into building aid. And again, we're seeing some relief in the trailer bill for about $50 million cap. Always there was a $50 million cap on how much money could be spent on building projects, and that's lifted for this biennium, if in fact this budget passes. So I don't know, Sue, if you want me to talk about any of the other highlights of the Senate budget, or does they pretty much cover the Freedom account?
Let me just throw in one thing in terms of that we're also facing. We have about 20 charter schools in New Hampshire. Charter schools by legislative thing get about $7,000 per student from the state. That
Yes.
does not make up for all of the tax money that the public schools get. They get about $3,500, $3,600.
Right.
We are now adding, there was a $42 million federal grant to double the number of charter schools. And we will also be dealing with that soon. And
That's
that's
right.
going to be a huge take away from what's going to the local schools. And what
And-
doesn't go to the local schools comes out of your property tax.
And I just want to add too, Sue, that part of that, those charter schools, the local school district remains responsible for any children in those districts with special needs. So
Right.
that's an additional cost that the local school district incurs. And I just also want to add that during this House and Senate process for the freedom accounts, we received over 7,000 people who were opposed to the voucher proposal and only about 500 who were in favor of it. So clearly the state of New Hampshire does not want a voucher program. But what we are seeing this year in the House and the Senate is this movement to the extreme right. And it's been a very, very difficult situation. But again, we did see UNH and the community college, there was a plan to merge the two. And luckily in the Senate edition of the budget, that's been taken out. So Sue, do you want me to talk any more about that, or do you want to stick with
But
mostly with the freedom
let's go
account?
back to questions on that.
Okay.
Let's go to Mary Wiley, who's going to talk a little bit about what resources we're going to give people.
Sure.
Mary? I don't know where she is.
Here I am. I'm sorry, I was muted.
Oh, there you are.
The same old problem. I'm going to post these in the chat after I speak because it's hard for me to do them both at the same time. But there are several organizations in New Hampshire that provide good information about, I'm just trying to find my proper notes here. Sorry, I was a little, oh yeah.
While Mary looks for those, I'm going to tell you that she is the author of the My Turn that appeared in the Concord Monitor and the op-ed that occurred in the Union Leader. And we're going to put that link in there too, because that's a wonderful way for people to read and to be able to make comments to their legislators. So it's yours, Mary.
Thank you, Sue. And just about that op-ed, that op-ed is really written, I opposed this SB 130 for all sorts of policy reasons, but that op-ed, the main point of it is that even lawmakers who support EFAs should not be voting for the budget with this bill in it, because there are no safeguards in this bill to protect against mismanagement of our tax dollars. And there's a lot of just loopholes in there that are sloppy. And in 2018, when the House Finance Committee considered the SB 193, they spent, it was either 13 or 14 working sessions of many hours each going through it with a fine tooth comb, and they still found it wasn't, a similar bill wasn't really ready yet. And this needs to be gone through that way. I don't want to see one of these bills become law, but if it does, I want it to at least be responsible. And that's what that op-ed is about. I'm also going to be posting links to 3 different organizations in New Hampshire that provide really good information that's relevant to this discussion. They're all nonpartisan organizations, nonprofits. And for each of them, I'll put the links. You might be interested in going to their websites and signing up for their alerts and their newsletters. One is Reaching Higher New Hampshire, which supports and promotes policy and practices to strengthen public education and improve outcomes for all New Hampshire students. One is the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, which informs the public about the condition of our public schools and their funding and advocates for making the system of funding more equitable for students and for taxpayers, so that zip code is not determining kids' opportunity. And one is the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, which produces regular reports about the fiscal and economic challenges facing New Hampshire and provides resources to people interested. And I'm also going to post 2 upcoming events. One is on Thursday. It was already mentioned at the very beginning. Kent Street Coalition is having its regular monthly meeting, and the focus is, it's called Democracy in the Balance, Why We Need the For the People Act. And Congressman Chris Pappas will be there, and I'll put a sign up for people who are interested. And the other is tomorrow night, or tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 5:30. It's the St. Anselm's Center for Ethics is presenting a program called Schools, Funding and Choice, Solutions to Inequities in New Hampshire Schools. And I don't know much. I know one of the panelists is a retired superintendent from New Hampshire who's very pro public education. I'm not so sure about who the other panelists are and what their thoughts are about privatization. But the director of the Center for Ethics at St. Anselm's, which is the host of this meeting coming up, is the founder of the Free State movement. So I'm a little skeptical about whether this might be a slanted presentation or not. And I would encourage people to attend and weigh in if there's an opportunity via chat or questions, just to potentially push back if you think that information is provided that may not be what you think of as accurate. So I'm going to post links to those organizations and to those upcoming events and to my op-ed as soon as I stop talking.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
I will tell you tomorrow, Corinne Cascaden is the superintendent. She was superintendent of Berlin, did a wonderful job up in Berlin, and Berlin has lots of financial troubles and still does. But Corinne also served as a member of the commission that we had looking at our state funding that nobody is looking at the results of, but that's the way it is. Dave, if you've got 2 questions you can pull out and ask. 2 general questions.
I do. I've got, I'm kind of pulling them out more from comments than specific questions, but let me throw 2 at you, Jack and Jennifer, if you don't mind. I'm going to go back to to Sue's comment on SB 61, which is the right to work bill being rejected. She said the 38th time. I think she was exaggerating a little bit.
No, I'm not. That's what I read.
Okay.
I'll
Anyway,
take it.
so I know that right to work has been used as a weapon against public schools because they try to weaken teacher unions. And I wonder, Jack and Jennifer, if you might comment on what you think, if there might be any implications nationally for right to work being rejected in New Hampshire. Will that have an effect anywhere across the country? The other question I have that has come up is that New Hampshire has been kind of inundated with people representing the Free State Project. And it seems to me that that's a growing concern. And I wonder if there's any link with that, with voucher programs that are being at least attempted to be adopted in this state. And by the way, thank you both for joining us tonight. It's been great.
Thank you for having us. So I'll go first. So alas, the answer to your first question about whether New Hampshire's rejection of right to work will have national implications, the answer is no. We have a Supreme Court case decision now on the books, the Janus case that basically made the whole country right to work. And so, we often think about this in terms of, it being targeted at teachers, but the reason that there has been so much interest for so long in weakening the power of public sector unions is because of the advocacy they do that has nothing to do with education, that they are the organized force that demands things like more generous welfare policies, higher taxes for all sorts of social spending. So if your goal is to drastically lower the tax burden on people, the richest among us in particular, then of course, your goal is going to be to make it harder for people to come together and rally on behalf of the opposite cause. Yes, this absolutely has to do with the Free State Project. And I think what makes New Hampshire so interesting is that when Jack and I go around and talk to people in all sorts of other states, we really have to put together the pieces of the puzzle in other states, right? You have to sort of figure out, okay, these legislators are interested in this, and here are the policy groups that are aligned behind it. Here are the big donors. Here's where we think they're headed. But because you now have such a large presence of Free State representatives in your state, and I mean representatives literally in Concord, but also people who just believe very passionately, they are very explicit about what their end goal is. They don't believe in public education, and they don't believe in the taxes that pay for it. And so this, I think, should make your job as advocates a lot easier. You don't have to go around telling people that there's something happening behind closed doors that they don't know anything about. This is a point of pride for Free State representatives. And Jack, I don't know if you have anything to add. Jack, you got to hear our excellent podcast about the Free State Project. So I know you learned a lot.
No, nothing to add.
Jennifer, can I just ask, if I go to Have You Heard, can I listen to that? Can I listen to one of the past podcasts?
Yes, I put a link in the in the chat, and I'll put another one in right now.
That's fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating to me, but I'm getting concerned about time. And so I need to tell people what's going to happen in the next couple of days. The House and the Senate will meet again on Thursday, June 10th, and they will determine the fate of Senate and House bills that were changed by the other body. So House Bill 1 and 2 are the budget bills. House Bill 1 is money and the numbers. House Bill 2 is the legislative policy that has to be changed in order to make those numbers work. It's House Bill 2 that you'll find the voucher bill, the abortion bill, and the bill against critical race theory in New Hampshire. So that's in House Bill 2. I do not believe the House will agree with the Senate. Ken Weiler, chair of the House Finance Committee, has already said the Republicans will not agree to a committee to the Senate, so that a committee of conference will be formed. That committee of conference will be formed on Thursday. If you are interested in making sure that your representative knows what's happening, what your opinion is now, you need to let the rep know now before June 10th. When June 10th comes and they set up the committee of conference, I will make a list of who's on the committee of conference and what their email is. My email is in the chat room. You can send me an email. I'll send you that information directly. But I will also say to you, if Mary Jane Wallner is the Democrat put on as a House representative on the committee, she knows more about budgeting than you and I will ever know. And she doesn't need to know what your opinion is. She shares your opinion, I should say, so she can do that. But you are going to want to let people know on the committee of conference to see what happens and how that plays out. I have been on the committee of conference when we met 5 days, and you met early in the morning until late at night, and got a couple hours sleep and went back the next day to do that. So it will be a drop down, drag out fight, I'm sure. We'll see what happens. And then we wait and we watch and we see what happens. So if you have any questions about the policy and what's going to happen on Thursday, that's it. Mary Heath, Representative Heath, what did I leave out? All the money.
I think you have it. I just am fearful, and I'm hoping it will be Mary Jane that gets put on the committee of conference, but everything is wait and see. They may just put all Republicans on, sadly.
I'm not sure they can totally do that, but this group tends to do things that I didn't know could be possible. So it's 7:30. We'd like to leave you with that. Louise, did we miss something? What do we need to cover, Louise?
No, I think you did a great job of covering everything, including action items, which I think is essential that people really get in touch with their representatives. I would also say to call the governor and 271-2121 and let him know.
Oh, say that again, please. 271-2121.
21. Yes, and let the governor know that we want fully funded public schools. And that until we do that, we should not be looking at any program like school vouchers, educational savings accounts. Our first task at hand is to make sure that we are funding the schools so that every child can get out of the schools what they need. So I'm just really appreciative of this amazing panel that, as always, Sue, you always do a great job leading us through things. And it's great to have Representative Heath here, who has served so well as an advocate of education. And then to our two special guests, Jennifer and Jack. We're really grateful for the work that you your ongoing work and this book, which is so insightful. I'm really excited to look at your podcast. So, so I think I guess I would just turn it over to Mary to see if there was anything else that Mary had in mind. But this was a fantastic program and really appreciative of everyone who attended tonight from all perspectives.
Thank you.
Did you mean Mary Wilkie? Or did you mean Mary?
I meant Mary Wilkie. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Mary Wilkie.
Okay. No, I don't have anything to add except just thank you to everybody. This was really an informative program, and I really appreciate that so many people were here, and I learned a lot. I hope other people did too.
I am just thrilled to meet Jack and Jennifer and find out that there are people that are out there that think the way we do. So we really, really appreciate that. We appreciate the book. I'm pushing it, Jack. I'm pushing it to everyone, all the educators I know. And I'm now going to go back and listen to the podcast.
Well, thanks so
thank
much
you.
for having us. And, we're just on the other side of the border if you want us to come up and visit. And I speak for both of us, don't I, Jack? Jack loves the road trip.
Yes. In this case, you do, Jennifer. It was great.
And maybe we can have musical accompaniment from your daughter.
That's right.
So
That's
that would
good.
Yeah.
Perhaps by the time that everybody's comfortable with in-person events, it'll be ready.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.
That was lovely. Thank you, everybody. As always.
So thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you to all our presenters and to all our participants. Thank you. I look forward to talking more.
Yes. Rob, I think you're going to cut us off, right?
Yeah, I'm just playing around with it. Did somebody copy the chat and copy it down?
I will.
I did.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Maybe somebody
right.
else would too, just to be sure it's a fail safe.
I did as well. Yep.
Okay,
So-
great. Thank you, everybody. That was a great meeting. I'm going to shut off the recording now and